So our first teacher of the night is Jessica Murphy. She works at the Brooklyn Museum and specializes in things like scent and a lot of different contemporary artists. And we love having her because she doesn't teach as much at the museum as she would love to. And we give her a platform to teach, and she's amazing at it. And we're really happy to share her with you, and that you guys are all here to participate and coming out on a Friday night to learn something new. So kudos to you guys, and we're warming up for Jessica.
Thank you for being here tonight. As David alluded to, I have spoken with Olio about perfume and perfume history and culture in the past, but I'm getting back to my roots in this one as an art historian, which is my training and background. My graduate degrees are in art history, and I've been working in museums for, I think, over a decade now at a couple different major museums, including the Brooklyn Museum presently. And for a long time, really actually going back to my grad school seminars, now that I think about it, I've been interested in the lesser known women artists who were affiliated with major art historical movements in 19th and 20th century arts. And it seems to be something I keep gravitating back to. I'm going to work the pointer. Yes, I am, okay. Our big show at the Brooklyn Museum this summer was called Georgia O'Keeffe, Living Modern. Did any of you have a chance to see it? Yay. I'm sorry it just closed, but there is a wonderful publication on sale right here at the Strand if you want to get a feel for the show and you're interested, you should look at that. It was a show that gave us a fresh look at O'Keeffe by making connections between her art and other aspects of her life, including her wardrobe and objects from her homes. And also this summer, still going on, at the Jewish Museum is an exhibition of the art of Florine Stettheimer, another of my favorites, a really wonderful and hard to categorize artist who was at the center of the New York avant-garde from the 1920s through the 1940s. However, tonight I'll be speaking about three other female artists who I'm pretty willing to bet you haven't heard of. And I chose them because they are not well known, and because they were artists whose work I came across in different museum collections in New York, and I wanted to learn more about them and dug a little bit deeper. Their names are Peggy Bacon, Abastenia St. Eberle, and Isabel Whitney. And they're all represented in museum collections around the city. And sometimes their art even comes out into the galleries, but more often than not, it's in storage. They came out of the same context as Georgia O'Keeffe and Florine Stettheimer. They were based in New York as artists. And they went through some of the same struggles and victories, but I feel that their experiences were even more typical of most women artists working during this time period, who didn't achieve the fame that O'Keeffe did and who had to balance their fine art with their other work and obligations throughout their lives. They came from the generation of women born in the 1880s and 1890s, some of whom became known as the New Women. And I'm sure some of you have heard of the New Women in history or women's studies classes. This was a segment of the population that was discussed avidly by cultural commentators and critics and the public during their time on both sides of the Atlantic. And we could kind of think of them as the millennials of their time in that respect. Everyone was talking about the New Women and what they were all about. And if they chose, these women took advantage of certain social and economic changes that were occurring during their lifetime. For example, women of this generation were much more likely to work outside the home as urban populations were expanding and there were more jobs in places like factories and offices and new department stores. By 1900, the American workforce included about 5 million women, or 20% of women over the age of 10. And if they belonged to the middle and upper classes, American women were much more likely to attend college. In 1900, women earned 19% of bachelor's degrees awarded in the US, and by 1930, their share had doubled to 40% of bachelor's degrees awarded. The New Women and the women who came after them were known for being a lot more physically active than their mothers and grandmothers' generation, for being more publicly visible, for wearing fashions that were a lot less restrictive than those of the later 1800s. They were no longer that fragile Victorian ideal with the hoop skirts. And in the United States, after 1920, thanks to the 19th Amendment, they were legally able to vote. So this is to set the scene a little bit, and I bring in this cartoon from a newspaper in 1913 to illustrate these options were often presented to women as a very black and white choice. This is college graduate, and on one side, she's being wooed by a suffragette who's encouraging her to pursue women's rights in a career, and on the other side, there's a Cupid trying to lure her towards marriage and motherhood, and it's very much an either-or proposition. Throughout the 1800s, women were getting artistic training, but they were often doing it as an accomplishment for young white women of the upper middle class and upper classes. After the Civil War, more women than ever started enrolling in art schools, but they were doing it for different reasons. They expected to actually have a career in the industrial arts or the fine arts, instead of just painting or drawing as a pastime to show that their families were wealthy and cultivated until they could marry well and set up a household. And according to census numbers, the female percentage of people who identified themselves as fine artists in America rose from 10% in 1870 to 48% in 1890. So there was a real surge of female art students who expected to go further after graduation. Except that they were often contending with a lot of the same restrictions and discriminations they would have faced in other fields. Maybe not as much as in something like medicine or law, where women were really a minority, but there were still certain obstacles in their path to professionalization. In art school, there were certain classes that were women only or men only. The teachers were all men, so there weren't any female role models or mentors to guide their path in a more personal way. And then after graduation, there were a lot of social clubs for male artists. There were a lot of organizations for male artists. And these were where you networked and where you showed your art around the city. So women were automatically excluded from a lot of these venues. So instead, they started to form their own clubs. They would stage their own exhibitions. And they continued to petition at the schools, or even started new schools, where they felt they would get the same training as their male peers. And in the meantime, they were often, then as now, balancing their work as artists with other employment, with their roles as wives and mothers, with their commitment to social causes and all the other hats they wore. And like all women making this effort in the 1910s and 20s, they faced criticism and scrutiny, as well as encouragement. For every supportive voice, there was a warning, even a condemnation about the choices they were making. And they were constantly navigating society's opposing expectations, which I think we can see in this pair of political cartoons. In the one at the left, an allegorical female is showing a list of options to a woman's place being the home, but also the new possibilities: law, industry, the school, the stage, business, the arts. But on the other hand, on the right side, this woman is ascending another kind of list, leaving behind love and marriage, trying to get to career and fame, and ending up at the top looking very haggard and alone. Loneliness is the top rung there. Weirdly, in backtracking and Google searching that image on the right, I ended up on a blog from the past year where someone was using that image to show us how things should still be, and said that it was making an important contemporary point that we should remember. So apparently these images are still in circulation by me, but other people with other possibly slightly different viewpoints. So our first woman is Peggy Bacon that we'll meet. She's mainly remembered for her caricatures. She worked a lot in printmaking, and she gives us a great look into her life as an artist and woman in New York in the 1920s and 30s. She was born in Connecticut in 1895 as Margaret Bacon, and she was the daughter of two New York artists. From 1915 to 1920, she studied at the Art Students League here in Manhattan, and she learned the academic method that had been used in Western art schools for the past few centuries. And it was very regimented. Students began by sketching from plaster casts of famous sculptures from antiquity or the Renaissance. Then they sketched from a live human model that would pose for them, clothed unclothed, and then they would be permitted to work in oil paint. It was a method that stressed a really thorough knowledge of anatomy and lighting and perspective, and it upheld idealized conceptions of physical beauty and often took its subjects from history and mythology. This is the work of one of Peggy Bacon's teachers, Kenyon Cox, who held on to this academic tradition well into the 20th century. This gives you an idea of what these women were expected to do in school and beyond. However, Bacon's generation of women, at least, was the first to share equal opportunities in their education. Before her time, we see female students and male students in separate life drawing classes working from the nude model. And the Art Students League was the first New York art school to introduce co-ed life classes where male and female students could mingle together and sketch from the same nude posing for them. So Peggy Bacon captured this moment in her print, A Frenzied Effort, where we see everyone very crowded together in this studio at the League. The women have the bobbed haircuts and the shorter skirts of this year, and they're sitting side by side with their men, everyone focused on that same female model towards the back with the drape in back of her. However, Bacon did have other teachers, including John Sloan and George Bellows, who took her in another direction. And they upheld a credo of art for life's sake, rather than art for art's sake. And they encouraged their students, once they had learned how to do things, so to learn the rules, but then to feel free to break them. So to show the less glamorous aspects of daily life in New York. They were known as the Ashcan School because they would paint and draw anything they saw on the street down to its ash cans. And they encouraged their students to look at everyday life, to look at ordinary people interacting, to sketch quickly on the street, to not worry about making things polished and refined, but to really take their world as its subject matter. Sloan often depicted the working class at home and around the city, and Bellows did all kinds of things, but his boxing scenes are some of his most famous works. Even as a student, Bacon showed her sense of humor in her art, and here she's showing a moment in her education where George Bellows, whose boxing painting we just saw, is presiding over a group of students in smocks. And in a much later interview, Bacon recalled that he had said to her, "Why don't you quit? You'll never be an artist. You'll never be able to do anything." But then at the end of the year when he saw this, he said, "That is wonderful. That's really fine. That's the best thing that has been done in this class all year." So she was able to, I guess, to gain some support and recognition from him. She also went outside the studio and showed herself around the city as an independent woman and artist. She often included self-portraits in her works, and I've put in handy blue arrows there. She's showing herself as one of the passengers on a subway car, riding alone with her canvases and her sketch pads, and she signed one of them on the back, so her signature doubles as identifying the figure. She's got it tucked under her arm. And in the right, she's buying supplies for her art classes online with the other male and female students. She did capture the fun that she and her fellow bohemians were having as art students here in Dance at the Art Students League. And sometimes she showed the more frustrating aspects of her chosen career. This is called the Patroness, and it was inspired by working for a somewhat apparently difficult and demanding client, unnamed, who hired Bacon to paint her cats. Bacon also touched upon the issues of women's rights, which interested her greatly. So in this cartoon for the publication Good Morning, she showed a young woman shocking her older family members with her new above-the-ankle skirts, and I think she's got a little bit of a bobbed hairstyle there, and they're reacting very dramatically. It says, "Millicent asserts her emancipation." And this isn't a great reproduction, but in this drawing of 1915, she showed a woman promoting women's suffrage and the right to vote from an actual soapbox on the street. In 1920, Bacon married the artist Alexander Brooke, whom she'd met when they were both students at the Art Students League. And the couple and their two children divided their time between a home in Greenwich Village and a home in the artist colony of Woodstock, New York. And it was during these years she really became committed to printmaking, in part because it was something she could do on a small press in her home studio, whereas Alexander Brooke painted outside the home in a separate studio space. And I like this quote I found from her. They're dressed up for some kind of party here, but she says, "We did do very good teamwork for a great many years. We worked together, we pooled our resources, and we brought up the kids together." In numerous works from these years, Bacon depicted the couple's gatherings with other artists and dealers and writers and editors, and sort of every figure in these scenes can be identified by people who know a lot about this world. And she gives a sense of, the mix of all their occupations and their opinions and how stimulating it was for them. This is called A Few Ideas. And she includes herself as one of the figures sitting around the table. They've got cocktails, they're having conversation. The book has lots of bookcases and works of art. In 1940, her marriage to Alexander Brooke ended in divorce. She had mixed feelings about the split. She said, "I was shattered by our divorce. I felt humiliated. I felt I was a failure as a wife. I was really shattered. Then, of course, I realized I was much better off." She was a rare example of a woman who was combining marriage and family and professional work as an artist. She kept her own last name. She kept creating and exhibiting. And then as her children grew older, she taught art around and beyond New York. She worked at the Whitney Studio Club, which was a forerunner of the Whitney Museum. And she illustrated about 60 books, 19 or so of which she wrote, which was a steadier source of income than some of her paintings and printmaking. She was also a magazine illustrator for publications like The New Yorker and Vanity Fair. And in this self-portrait, which I love, it's titled Lady Artist. I can only assume she's being a little satirical here. She shows herself as this hardworking, self-sufficient individual with her etching plate on her lap and some sketches and studies scattered around her and her own cat. And she's fully engrossed in her work while all the neighbors nearby are just sort of idly looking out their windows. Abastenia St. Ledger Eberle, one of the more imposing names I've come across in researching. She's slightly older than the other two of this trio I've assembled for you. She was born in 1878 in Iowa, the daughter of a physician and a musician. And she moved to New York, and like Bacon, she studied at the Art Students League starting in 1899. She focused on sculpture, and she received the same kind of academic training that Peggy Bacon would have received in drawing and painting, drawing before ever working with clay or stone, working from the antiquity, working from the Renaissance. After graduation, she had a studio in Greenwich Village on West 9th Street, and she worked primarily in bronze, these small-scale figures, or tabletop size, usually mythological subjects or idealized figure studies, building on that academic training. She shared a studio with another sculptor named Anna Hyatt Huntington in Midtown, and they collaborated on several large-scale, really ambitious multi-figure works with humans and animals. There's a young boy modeling for this figure of a man and a bull. None of these survive, unfortunately, but there is a great Huntington of some kind of wild cat in the American Art Sculpture Courtyard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which you may have seen if you've been there. After a few years of working in this vein, the small mythological pieces, the larger figurative and animal studies, Eberle changed direction in her work. She took a trip to Italy. She came back. She started to get really inspired by the social worker and activist Jane Addams, and she began thinking more about the importance of progressive and reformist causes in her own life. And she felt that art had the potential to address social issues, including immigration and poverty and women's suffrage. And she said of this return to New York, "I had steeped myself in the classic arts, and I was filled with the past and seemed to lose hold on the present. But when I landed in New York, I began again to sense the modern spirit. I made little journeys over to the east side, and then my awakening came. I broke away from the archaic. And she became associated with the Ashcan School that I mentioned a little bit earlier, although she doesn't get mentioned as much as the painters and the men of this group, including George Lux. This wonderful painting is at the Brooklyn Museum. And a favorite subject for the Ashcan group of urban realists was the city's immigrant neighborhoods. New York's population had increased from, in 1870, 1.5 million to, in 1915, 5 million. Largely due to an influx of immigrants, especially from Ireland and Italy and Eastern Europe and China, many of whom were living on the Lower East Side in tenements. So in keeping with this new focus, Eberle left her Greenwich Village studio and rented a space on the Lower East Side where she could spend more time studying people's lives there. And then, because she really wanted to avoid the feeling of being a tourist, she moved there. And she boarded and worked at the music school Settlement on East 3rd Street. Settlement houses were organizations that served newly arrived immigrants in certain ways. They gave education, they gave job training, and they provided social services and helped communities to find each other and then to integrate more broadly into the neighborhood and the city, and to give them skills that would help them get into the New York job market. Eberle said in an interview, "Art is dependent on society for inspiration, material, life itself. And in that same measure, art does owe society a debt. The artist must see for the people, reveal them to themselves and to each other." So she began to depict her neighbors on the Lower East Side instead of goddesses and nymphs and fauns. And especially she liked working with children and mothers. And there was a lot of coverage of Eberle's work in New York City newspapers. It's been fun to look back and see. Sometimes the language is very much of the period. You know, I don't think we use the word urchins nowadays. And, you know, they always point out she's a woman sculptor or a woman artist or a lady sculptor. But they really did in-depth interviews with her on why she'd set up her studio on the Lower East Side and why she had chosen to work with these real-life models, because she had trained to do things more like this. And I love Cecilia Beau, I love Mary Cassatt, I love these impressionist and academically trained women artists who did portraits. You know, they showed children of more affluent families, you know, very beautifully dressed, behaving in this very genteel manner, usually indoors, posed, you know, immaculate. And this was something that Eberle and her classmates would have been expected to learn and to do for clients. This was a way to make good money. But Eberle instead shows a girl dancing on the street to the music of a hurdy-gurdy musician that she encourages us to imagine by calling it hurdy-gurdy dance. And I brought in a period photo of a hurdy-gurdy musician on the street and the children on the Lower East Side listening to him. You know, and this girl's stockings are falling down and her hair's coming down a little bit and she's not posing and, you know, she's not perfectly attired and she doesn't care. She's just being a child. And this unguarded appearance of children at play was something Eberle really wanted to capture the more time she spent in the neighborhood. This work is usually on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I've looked at that a lot. And especially when you look at it and walk around it, you get the sense of the forward motion of this girl who only has one skate for one foot, but she's rolling forward nonetheless. And Eberle would try to really get to know the children and their families so that they would feel relaxed around her and feel like neighbors and friends rather than like models per se. Her Little Mother alludes to a situation that a lot of families were dealing with. If both parents were working in factories and sweatshops, the older children became the de facto caretakers of the younger children. And she shows the trust and affection between the sister and the baby. I'm bringing in a period photo just to show that this was something people were observing and talking and writing about in the press. But she tried to avoid being too sensational and really emphasized the childhood and the emotional closeness of her figures. And in her work, Rag Picker, she's showing an older woman, and she's trying to make this a contemporary vignette. These were people who gathered rags to sell to the rag men, but she's also, I think, granting her a sort of timelessness and dignity at the same time. Eberle sold these works through a few different New York galleries, and many of them were made in very limited editions of 2 or 3, or perhaps 5 or 6 pieces. She would work with a foundry, but she had a steadier source of income through pieces that she made in larger editions, like inkwells and candlesticks and tobacco jars and bookends. She wrote in a letter that she had sold more than 80 casts of her hide-and-seek bookends, and she hoped they would keep selling so well because this kind of thing was her bread and butter that then allowed her to do more sensitive pieces of the immigrants she was meeting in her neighborhood. Meanwhile, she was also very active in the fight for votes for women, bringing another charming period cartoon reminding you that it's a choice. Either you are a mother at home, or you are a suffragette on the street corner, which almost makes her sound like a prostitute, weirdly, in some way. So in 1915, this was one of the topics of discussion in New York. There was a referendum coming up in New York State on whether or not to allow women to vote, which some other states had already gone through. And Eberle had already been active. She was in a suffrage parade with a group of women sculptors marching as women sculptors in 1911. And in this year, 1915, she helped to organize an art exhibition to raise money for the suffrage movement. And this benefit had works by only female artists, almost 100 of them. And the profits went to funding this march that was held in New York that month. And there was a lot of coverage of it and the kinds of art that were in it and who participated and how this was the way these women were throwing their talents and their time behind this movement. The referendum did not succeed in this month in 1915, but things like the parades and the exhibition, I think, gave the suffragettes momentum until they received the New York State vote 2 years later and the national vote 5 years later. So Eberle continued to exhibit through the 1920s and the 1930s. She lived primarily in Westport, Connecticut, in an old barn she converted to a studio. Unfortunately, she had heart trouble that kept her from doing much new work, but she kept exhibiting almost up to the time of her death in 1940. And she never stopped believing that the artist could and should be the specialized eye of society, as she put it in an interview. And here's our third story. Isabel Whitney, the one native New Yorker of this trio I've picked for you, primarily because 2 paintings by her showed up on a wall in the gallery at the Brooklyn Museum, and I had never heard of her and had no idea who she was, and sort of went into our files and then went further on my own and got really curious about her. She was actually a Brooklynite. She was born there in 1878. And was one of 2 daughters of an affluent silk textile manufacturer. The family was somehow distantly related to Eli Whitney of the cotton gin fame. I'm not exactly sure how to trace that family tree, but her mother was active in Brooklyn's elite social circles. And as a girl, Whitney attended boarding school abroad and traveled throughout Europe. She said that when she came back to New York, all her female peers were hosting parties and preparing to become debutantes, but she wanted to stay home and paint instead. And with her mother's approval, Whitney instead pursued a career as an artist. And she began by attending Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, rather than going to a girls' finishing school, which a lot of her friends were doing. And she said, "I finally told my mother I wanted to be a professional artist. She may have been disappointed that I didn't make a debut, marry some nice man, and settle down, but she did not say much. You see, she paints too, so I think she understood." And after graduation from Pratt, Whitney worked in several artistic capacities to earn her living. And this is something we frequently see, not just for women artists, but for most artists in this period, especially women. She illustrated children's books for a while. This was a field that was thought to be especially appropriate for female artists since they were thought to have maternal and feminine inclinations that would make them really good at illustrating children's books. She designed wallpaper patterns, including borders for children's bedrooms, like the one at the bottom. Unfortunately, I've only been able to find black and white reproductions. and murals for upscale private homes, including landscape and garden scenes like the one at the top. So this was a source of income for her for several years. Then around 1920, she got really interested in fresco painting, and she started trying to create or recreate the working methods of the Renaissance masters, and received several commissions to paint fresco murals, large scale, for public buildings like hotels around New York City. She was hired by the Brooklyn Museum to decorate the ceiling of one of its galleries in 1925, and this was not a usual choice for a woman artist at the time to do murals. You know, they're large, they're often public, they're very physical. You're up on scaffolding, and local newspapers found this very interesting that she was doing this, and they would occasionally interview her on site, talk to her about her project, and they noted how she was fearless about climbing up to these high spots, and she said something like, you know, they asked her, would anything be too high for you? And she said, well, maybe the Woolworth building, but I could probably do it if I really pushed myself. And then they would always comment on the outfit she wore for painting her murals, because she wore a smock and bloomers and tennis shoes, so that she could climb up and down the ladder. In 1925, that was not what you wore out in public as a woman. And in this, you know, the 1920s is a pivotal decade for New York in so many ways, in women's shifting social roles, and then the transformation of the city itself. You know, we have radio, we have movies, there's lots more mass transit, and so many new tall buildings that are changing the skyline of the city. Whitney was living in Brooklyn Heights on Remsen Street, and she was observing the changes even just in the microcosm of her own neighborhood. And she said she would paint from balconies or from inside her parked car, where she could see without being seen. She painted a series of paintings of her neighborhood. Sometimes the 19th century brownstones, and sometimes the new buildings that were going up in new construction. And she said in a newspaper interview, I don't want to lose sight of the beauties of things that are past and gone. That's why I paint the heights, hoping to preserve something of the old spirit while it still lingers in odd corners. One of her favorite settings was the Penny Bridge. This was a small iron pedestrian bridge that connected Montague Terrace and Pierpont Place, and she showed it as a favorite gathering spot for children and families. And in the distance across the river, you can see the Wall Street ferry terminal that received the ferries shuttling back and forth from Montague Street Terminal in Brooklyn over to Manhattan and back. And sometimes she showed us the Penny Bridge in the evening. So this isn't the greatest photo. I took it in storage at the Brooklyn Museum. But I hope you can see there are young women and their military dates in uniform on the bridge. The women are wearing the shorter dresses of the late 1920s and the hairstyles of the decade, and they're taking advantage of some of their newer social freedoms by staying outside past dark with their companions on shore leave. If you're wondering where the Penny Bridge is, unfortunately, it is not there anymore. As Whitney might have guessed, it was to be demolished in 1946 to make way for ramps onto the Bronx-Queens Expressway. Sometimes you can get the tension between the old and the new in her art. This one's called On Columbia Heights, and we're looking through a fence. I like the way she's stacked several shallow views. You get the fence, you get a garden with an old fountain, then the backs of what I think are carriage houses, then the ships in Brooklyn Harbor, and then the skyscrapers of Manhattan beyond that, all sort of sandwiched together. And one critic who was very sympathetic and enjoyed Whitney's art wrote, with the new Brooklyn skyline competing with the towers of Manhattan, leisurely distinguished old Brooklyn Heights must soon become a memory. Here we move on to the waterfront. This is called the Blue Peter. And we are with these women and children watching vessels at rest in the harbor at the end of Remsen Street, where Whitney lived. The name Blue Peter is the name of a maritime flag that's blue with a white square in the center, like the one towards the very top of the composition. And when it's flown, it is a sign that the ship is ready to leave port, so there's a sense of farewell or departure here. And then we can see the smokestacks of some factories that are being built around the harbor. So the the new Brooklyn is pushing right up to the edges of the old Brooklyn and transforming it while this new generation is watching. Sometimes Whitney gave an exclusive starring role to the newer structures. And in the Emerald Tower, she was looking at something that had just been built a couple years earlier. This is Columbia Heights toward Old Fulton Street. And this may even actually look familiar to some of you who are in that area or past that area. It was built as the headquarters for Squibb, the pharmaceutical drug manufacturer. We can see to the left a suspension cable for the Brooklyn Bridge. And the blue searchlight in the sky belonged to the St. George Hotel, which was a new development project in the neighborhood. There hadn't been hotels there before then. The title comes from the green lighting. This is called the Emerald Tower. And this group of buildings was occupied by Squibb till 1969, when the company moved to New Jersey. And from then until now, it was actually corporate headquarters for Jehovah's Witnesses. However, if you're keeping up with real estate news in Brooklyn, it is about to be changed into high-end office and retail properties under the joint ownership of Kushner Companies and 2 other developers. So just as Whitney herself guessed and continued to anticipate, Brooklyn continues to evolve and emerge and change. In the 1920s, actually, skyscrapers were really considered a subject for male painters because of their scale and their very public context. However, Whitney rejected that convention that women were better emotionally suited or technically suited as artists to stick with painting portraits or floral still lifes or interior domestic scenes. She was not afraid to climb ladders and paint murals, and she saw no reason that she should not paint modern architecture as one of her subjects. And I like this quote I found from a newspaper interview with her. Where men are accustomed to working with men, they always act as though they let women in as a privilege. A woman has to work out her own specialty on her own initiative to succeed with men in 1925. Despite their similar training, I chose these 3 because each really has a signature subject and a different style. For Peggy Bacon, it's bohemian life and the art world in Greenwich Village and beyond. For Abastenia Eberle, it's the daily life of tenement dwellers on the Lower East Side. And for Isabel Whitney, it's the changing cityscape of Brooklyn at a time of changing circumstances for women. They may not have been the most groundbreaking members of their generation as artists, but they were certainly trailblazers in the ways they shaped their lives and careers, I think. All of them balanced their art with other projects, commercial illustration, mass-produced decorative items, gallery work, writing, social activism. They all have stories to tell us about living modern, and I hope you've enjoyed introducing yourselves to them and hearing something about them. Thank you. Yeah, do we have a couple questions? Let me swing the mic. I know now the pressure's on, right? Has anyone seen the Florine Stettheimer show? Okay, please go. Please go. I don't work at the Jewish Museum. I don't receive any compensation for recommending that. I was also going to talk about her tonight, but she's like a whole hour in herself, which maybe I'll get to do somewhere somehow. But you should visit that show. And yeah, I just always encourage people when they're at our museums to sort of keep a mental count of how many women artists are on the walls. Surprisingly, this is still more of a topic of discussion than you'd think it would be. And I haven't even really addressed the issue of women of color and their representation of museums. Hi, yeah?
Hey, quick question about, it seems like one of the themes of all these women's work are kind of looking at New York as it has been, as it is, and with a little bit of wistfulness about the change. And that doesn't seem, I mean, when I think of a lot of artists now, that seems to be, has that always been a theme in New York art? Is this kind of, because the city is always evolving and changing and moving, this kind of sadness at that movement and kind of looking at at what it was with some fondness?
Personally, I think it's part of the New York condition. And I've reached an age now where I talk about stores and restaurants I used to go to that are gone. I cry about Takashimaya or whatever. I used to laugh a little bit when older relatives did it, and now I do it. But funny, looking back, people were talking in the late 1700s about how New York was always changing and it wouldn't stay still. And in this point, there's a lot of talk in the press, like buildings are coming down and buildings are going up and you can't keep track. There's so many stories like that in New York newspapers in 1910. So the artists were part of that, but there were other writers and thinkers and creative people thinking about how quickly things changed in New York 100 years ago. It's you kind of read the conversations and they seem weirdly timely. But even earlier than that, I think people would visit from Boston or Philadelphia or Newport and they would say, New York moves so fast and they just don't care about anything but money and they put things up and tear them down. So I think it's just been part of New York from the beginning. And I know there are, even, I don't know if you're familiar with the blog Jeremiah's Vanishing New York or with the blog Ephemeral New York, and they're both great resources, if you just want to sit down and feel sad about things. And there are always new things, and I know we shouldn't get too nostalgic. So I think it's interesting you're picking up on that sense of nostalgia, but there's also excitement. Peggy Bacon was very excited. She could just ride the subway herself to art school and be in a life drawing class with the boys and get married and get paid for her art at the same time. So I think there's a lot of optimism too, in addition to the sense that things are always changing, which is also part of New York, right?
I was wondering was it Eberle? Did she have any contact or overlap with Jacob Riis?
Did Eberle have any contact with the photographer Jacob Riis? I haven't found any evidence of direct contact, but she was certainly aware of his photography because it was published so broadly and printed reproductions of it were disseminated so broadly, and they're contemporaries. So she would have known about his views of tenement life, definitely. And maybe they bumped into each other. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out because they were working in the same neighborhood. But I don't have any, letters or discussions of, contact between them. But thank you. That's why I threw in a couple of Riis photographs for that context. Thank you. That is great.
Another round of applause for Jessica.
Now, after this, I put like 100 slides just in case I needed them for discussion.
Oh, there's more. There's more slides here.
All the way through. All the way through. Don't look. This is all the
Don't
stuff
watch
I couldn't
this.
fit.
Don't watch
All the
this.
stuff I couldn't fit. Don't look.
This is secret stuff.
Some other time I'll do
Yeah.
this somewhere.
This is a lot.
I like to be prepared.
Thank you, Jessica. That was awesome. One more round of applause for Jessica. Perfect. All right. Because this is a double feature, we have two professors. I don't know if it was confusing, but we have Ward Regan up next, who's been one of our go-to professors for at least a year now, right? He's been teaching with us for over a year, and he's probably taught 20 Olios. And he just, in the summer, decides to go to Spain for 3 weeks, and Olio almost falls apart every time he leaves us. We're just like, Ward, you can't keep doing that. You got to come back. So he's here, he's tanned, he's looking great, and he's excited to be back. All right. Ward, so it's just right
Let's leave
and
it on
left.
yeah.
Oh. That one.
Okay, no, the GDP one. Yeah.
That one. Cool. So do you want to try?
Yeah, let's see. Let's see how this works. Technology.
Yeah.
That way. Okay.
Perfect. You got it?
Yeah. All right, can you hear me without this? How's that? A little sort of ambient? I just hate feeling like Freddie Mercury. This big microphone in my face. So I have charts, so it's official. And I have charts put together by a German economist, and he's here, so we can bug him later if you don't like my charts. So I'm going to try and do a couple of things at the same time, and we'll see how much success I do. I want to do a little hard history of economics. I want to do a little economic history. And I want to do a little sociology, and I want to do a little sort of like, how shall we call it, myth-busting, okay? So the first thing I want to look at here is, this is well, you can read what it says, right? This is the way the classic don't read what the chart, what the PowerPoint thing says, but I'm going to do that now. This is U.S. GDP growth rate per capita starting in 1880, ending in about 2000. Can anybody guess what these weird little aberrations are in the timeline? What events? Sorry, what did you say, sir? S-curves? S-curves? No. What events in time do they represent? Right, so the Depression is one, and then the second one is World War II. And what I want just to note about, what I want to note about this is that in the post-bad scene, like this actually is like an echocardiogram. Like we're kind of through, we get this heart attack here. That's the Depression and the war. And after that, we have regulation. So just one of the things I want to point out about this, and this is something that is up for a lot of debate and discussion, but one of the things that we need to think about the so-called free market is that the free market isn't really free in the sense that like it's a free-for-all. There's lots of rules, there's lots of things that go on, and most people's favorite free market economist has fucking nothing to do with the modern era. It's Adam Smith. It was written in 1776, okay, let me repeat that date, 1776, right? Where this is a moment in time when he could not have imagined any economic player larger than a government, right? So one of the problems with dealing with Adam Smith and economies is it really has no application, as far as I'm concerned as a historian, to the modern world where corporations are larger than governments in many, many instances. But the thing here I want to look at is the radically unregulated nature of the early economy prior to the Great Depression. And it was called the Great Depression to differentiate it from all the other depressions that occurred beforehand. And then what we see is a slight compression of the range of change after regulation is put in place. If this chart was even better and went to 2008, you then see what the results of the 1999 deregulation again, the turning back of the Glass-Steagall Act did. Things went fucking hog wild again, and we had a major economic crash. Paul Krugman is willing to contend that the Great Recession of 2008 was easily as bad as the Great Depression by many, many, many markers. We can get into that later. Okay, next chart. Just forget. Okay, manufacture. Is that the one I wanted? 1, 2, yeah, okay. Manufacturing jobs. You have heard lately about, oh my God, the great exodus of American jobs to China and Guatemala and Tennessee, right? Okay. This didn't start recently. The actual decline of American manufacturing jobs is a distinctly post-war event. I mean, like, wham! Everybody starts to notice it, like, here, but it's actually going on for a really long time, okay? And in a manufacturing economy, which, you know, modern capitalist consumer society is, not having manufacturing jobs can be a deficit. We can then debate that later, too, with people from fucking Stern. That's the business school over there. And they will love what I'm going to talk about from a positive sense. I will tell you why it's probably not good for people. That's the gig economy. But the thing I want to point out is that, like, we've been losing manufacturing jobs for 70 years in this country. We've hollowed out what was the strongest manufacturing economy in the history of the world by reasons that have a lot to do with nothing we could have controlled, like, you know, World War II. But it is a real event that the structural nature of the United States economy has massively changed in the past 70 years, okay? Part of that transformation, is this thing. You see that blue line? That's wages. You notice what it sort of does starting in about 1973? What does it start to kind of do? Yeah, it stays the same, okay? Whereas the red line represents productivity, right? So if I read my graphs right, productivity increases, owners are making more money off their workers, workers aren't seeing the benefits of their increased productivity like they did back here, right? As productivity increased, so did people's wages. One of a friend of mine who's another economist who's not here today, Max Wolf, the son of Richard Wolf, the famous commie economist. No, he's not a commie, he's just a liberal. He talks about American economic growth starting in 1880 and ending in 1980. And we're just going to be generous with the chart. Okay. This is the period of American industrialization. one of the economic historical truisms is that when you industrialize an economy, you start to bring huge numbers of people up from wherever the fuck they were down at the bottom at peasant level to something more than peasant level. It's not like all of a sudden the Chinese figured out how to work hard 25 years ago and then like Shanghai just like sprung out of the ground from nowhere and now Chinese are driving around automobiles and they never thought about working hard before, okay? There is a direct correlation with the interjection of industrial production. Whoops. I think this is your pen. Industrial production technology and what happens to an economy. It's like you start to industrialize it and fuck money comes in. The bad part of that, here's your cap. The bad part of that is after an industrial economy like somewhere like Rochester, New York, goes up, like they said in the electric company, what goes up? Must come down. Right? So, all of you who want a really quick economics degree, after something goes up, it usually goes down. After it goes down, it's going to go up. Okay, so you've just saved $140,000 not having to go to Stern, okay? So my one really practical clue or hint for the day is don't buy anything in the stock market now when it's over 22,000. It's going to go down later, okay? But here's the thing we want to think about. This wages thing, okay? And one of the points here is that the economy that we're going to now talk about, this new gig economy, which if you don't know what it is, I'll give you in a minute, I'll get just working description. But what's being talked about in the post-2008 years, like the new conditions, the new normal, like, you know, kids are moving home after college. Last year, something like 84% of college graduates moved home. And this is this is like, wow, look at all these kids moving home. It's like, well, you know, actually, that 40-year period when wages were kind of good, where's my wages thing? Hold on. Where wages were kind of good from the end of the war to the 80s is actually aberrant, okay, in terms of like how good an economy can be. Same thing, the American dream. You come here, you work hard, whatever. That's really a result of an industrializing economy, not necessarily individual effort. And this is the other thing we need to think about, I'd say, American economics, American society, American worldviews. Americans tend to like to personalize your political, your economic, your social station and make it something that has to do with you and your character personally. Yeah, blame the fucking Puritans, fine, Weber talked about that. But we can also talk about what Barbara Ehrenreich talks about is the cult of like positive attitude. It's you walk by the stupid Presbyterian church with Norman Vincent Peale's statue over there and the power of positive thinking. You can't think yourself out of a recession. I don't care how hard you concentrate, right? So one of the other issues here is, in an economy where increasingly people are being made into little individual economic entrepreneurial units, you see those ads for, what's the thing? I got the name wrong last time. Fiverr, those obnoxious, motherfucking, supposed to be cool, trendy, hip, kind of consultant-looking dudes who, like, if you want something done, ask a busy person ad, really, really get my goat. Because, again, what it's doing is putting the whole onus of your economic condition on you and your attitude and your individual labor. Forget that every other industrialized economy has health insurance for its citizens. Forget that every other industrialized economy has college for its citizens, child care, elder care, a serious social net, right? Americans are working at a major deficit when it comes to individual overhead just to keep alive in the first place, all right? So that's another part of this picture. And so, when we talk about the gig economy, which is increasing dramatically, something like 15% of people now are considered in what are called alternative work environments or alternative work conditions. It's a nice way of saying you sort of work for somebody. And it's increasing dramatically. You know it as the 1099 complex or the consultant or the subcontractor, right? The thing is, it's actually not that new. What's the anomaly, in a sense, in the 220 some odd years of industrial capitalism is your employer actually employing you and paying you for shit other than for the 4 hours, the 8 hours, the 6 hours, the 12 hours, however many hours you're actually working. The idea that your business owes you health insurance and, benefits and retirement, that's not actually that common, particularly at the beginning of the industrial period. In the early 19th century, anywhere up until, I would say, the Civil War, it was far more common for people to essentially be subcontractors for somebody in an industry like, let's just pick clothing. Let's pretend this was once a clothing factory. It probably fucking was, okay? And what would happen is the guy who owned it would get a contract from the A.T. Stewart department store, which is 4 blocks down here on 8th Street, for, 1,000 shirts. And inside this very space would be subcontracted out through a series of people, different parts of the construction of that garment. Even to the point where you would have home manufacturing. That's how industrial clothing manufacturing really started in Britain and America, is you would send it out to people at their home, they'd make it at home, and then they would be recollected, okay? And at some point in the 19th century, American corporations decided, for reasons that are a little beyond me at the moment, that they actually had to employ everybody who did everything for them. So in like the golden age of the American corporation, 1865 to 1960, everybody worked for GE who worked for, the janitors worked for GE. The woman who was in the cafeteria ladling food was an actual GE employee, right? Now, we all know what the deal is. Every janitor, every food service person, everybody who's providing some service to a corporation doesn't actually really work for that corporation anymore. They've been subcontracted out. And so what you see here in this act is the corporation no longer really being responsible for the worker beyond anything other than the hours or the task that is given to them. Right, shedding the responsibility of these workers. Now, there's a couple of reports that have come out about this lately that are actually very interesting. There's one in England called the Taylor Report, and there's a longer one that came out done by the Rand Corporation. And I know the Rand Corporation, that name will make your hair stand on end because they do lots of studies about how you can survive nuclear war and stuff. But the Rand Corporation, and if you want to come and see me afterwards, I can give you the full title on this one, did a really good study on like working conditions in the United States right now. Its full title is The Rise and Nature of Alternative Work Arrangements in the United States, 1995 to 2015. And it is a great snapshot of how people went from employees to subcontractors or to consultants or to 1099 freelancers. Right? And like that sign in the subway, Fiverr? I'm a dyslexic, right? So I see something, I never know how to say it. So Fiverr, it tries to, it actually romanticizes the idea of like not having health insurance. Like you're on your own, you're making your way in the world out there, and you've got a tattoo on your face, so you really must know how to program well or something. Okay? Now, again, part of what I'm talking about is that there's been a shift in the past 40 years, 15 years. Anderson Consulting, which is a very big consulting group, says the trend towards, let's call it maybe it's Deloitte & Touche then that did this one, this most recent study, says that if the current trend in employment practices continues, by the year 2020, the world's largest 2,000 companies will only have actual employees in what's known as the C-suite. Anyone know what the C-suite is? No? Chief operating, no. Chief, So in other words, basically only board members. I give you an example of how this functions. Nobody works for Amazon who delivers anything. Nobody works for Amazon in an Amazon warehouse because Amazon doesn't have warehouses. Amazon subcontracts to Joe's trucking company for $300 million a year to deliver their shit. Joe then subcontracts with someone else and someone else and someone else to the point where it's some dude in Jersey with a car who's got to deliver. I am not fucking with you. Like, this is how your Amazon stuff gets to you, okay? And what it means is Amazon, it's like Pontius Pilate, right? Go ahead, kill Jesus. I got nothing to do with this. It ain't my problem. Go ahead, crucify the workers. They don't work for me. Okay? There was a lawsuit in which FedEx, you've seen the trucks with the guys in uniforms that say FedEx? FedEx took the corporate position that they're not our employees. They don't work for us. They just drive trucks that have our name on it and shirts that have our name on it, but they don't really work for us. They just look like they work for us. Huh? Yeah, some weird shit like that. And thank God some judge said, no. They actually worked for you. Like, if it looks like a duck, it smells like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So this is an interesting thing. Why would FedEx not want to have workers? Again, it comes back to the responsibility. One of the issues in capitalism is you're supposed to make money, right? And one of the, well, I mean, you're supposed to make money. Some of these fuckers who make tons of money, who like 2008, let me just go to my really nasty article about slavery, and then it'll connect to capitalism. So I'm reading today, getting ready for my talk, I'm reading in the Guardian a review of this Taylor report. And the Taylor report in Britain is a study of the gig economy without doing a lot of studying. It's a lot of anecdotal like stories, and it actually doesn't pose solutions, and it says how great the, quote, British system of employment is. It's one of the least critical studies I've ever read in my life. So the Guardian ripped them to shreds. And so I was reading this thing, and over to the right of the screen, where they have all the blinking ones, this article popped up and I just, the title grabbed me. I got sucked into reading it. 11 traveler family members convicted following slavery trials. So let me translate that for you who are not familiar with the United Kingdom. Travelers are the British equivalent of Roma, what used to be referred to as gypsies, which is inappropriate now. Okay, so the story here is that this this family ran a paving company, and apparently they housed their workers in really unsanitary conditions. And one of the criticisms of this family, who were having people living in trailers and exploiting them, while they worked for them, was that while they were exploiting these people, they were living lavish lifestyles. And my favorite part here, it shows a picture of you can't see it here, but I'll direct you to it later. The lavish lifestyle is like sort of like a vaguely upper middle class house. And they went on luxurious vacations to Barbados, Australia, Egypt, Mexico, the purchase of high-performance BMWs, spa days, and even cosmetic surgery. And I said to myself, wait, they're not describing some evil traveler family who's like, preying on really rare individuals. They're actually just describing capitalism, which is a system by which you make money by extracting as much labor as possible from the people who are working for you, so more of that money goes in your pocket. If you want to look this up, go ahead and look up Foxconn. Go ahead and read about the construction conditions anywhere, and I mean anywhere, in the Middle East. It is absolutely, positively, fundamentally slavery. Right? There was a big scandal that nobody heard enough about at NYU, where it turned out that one of the NYU campus buildings in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, was being built by a Qatari company who had hired probably Indonesians, and essentially, again, it's slavery. They take your passport, you're working. Like, I got a friend who's an architect who absolutely refuses to work in the Middle East anymore because he's not going to be responsible for people dying. And people are dying like they're falling like flies every day, right? So here I am reading this article, which is condemning this traveler family for living luxuriously off the labor and exploited labor of their workers, and yet not mentioning like that's the whole picture. And so when we're thinking now about what is the gig economy about, one of the things that comes out in the Taylor report is that the gig economy is so great because it provides corporations with flexibility. And corporations need to be flexible and nimble in order to adjust to market forces. The reality is, it's not so much flexibility as it is the low wages that come with not really hiring somebody. Okay? I can give you an example which is perhaps germane to people in this room. Adjuncts. Okay? And I use disclosure, crawl across the screen. I'm the former president of the adjunct union at NYU, and I've started 2 other adjunct unions. Let me tell you, you are not actually contingent, and in the technical labor universe, contingent means like, I need you now, but I don't need you later. Like a typist, which is what they called us when we were sitting across the table. That really didn't go over well with people. You're not really a contingent laborer if you've been an adjunct twice a semester for 15 years. You're just really cheap work. Okay? So this gig economy that we're hearing so much about, that's offering workers freedom to work from home and have kids and have a life, and apparently you can go like mountain biking while you're programming your access, okay? Because that's the Fiverr thing that's being sold to people. And again, it's part of this bizarre American cult of the individual, that you will actually be in control of your labor by having a corporation or a boss who has no responsibility to you whatsoever. And what's fascinating here is that there's not a lot of rumblings from below. There is little bits of news here and there. There was the freelancers movement for a little bit, but that really wasn't a movement. It was just an attempt to get cheaper insurance. One of the realities in this, let me get my next slide just a second here. One of the realities in the changing economy that is the United States is this. As union membership declined in the United States with its apex in the late 50s. And think about this. A union is the exact opposite of the gig economy. In a union economy, people are coming together, let's say all the horseshoe makers, all the bakers, all the truck drivers, all the whatever, in order to work in solidarity with each other to bring everybody else's wages up. Okay? What's the basic logic of the consultant economy, or the freelance economy, or the 1099 economy? It actually pits workers against one another. Yes, I know I sound like a stump speech from Union Square from 1936, saying worker all the time. But it's a fucking reality. You may be called an associate. You may be called a clinical professor. That's the new name for us at NYU. But you're a worker, man. Okay? And one of the issues here is, as a worker, what is your relationship going to be, A, to the people you work for, and B, to the other people you work with? I think I don't need to do a lot of explaining of what this graph is telling us. One line goes up, and the other line goes down. Up, bad, down, good. Down, bad, up, good, right? When workers, because it's not just, we had about 36%, 37% unionization in 1958. The reality of a unionized economy is that that brings wages up people who are not even in the unionized trades or a unionized business, because there's pressure from better paid workers to have to pay other people more. As union rates declined, and that ability to put pressure on employers, to raise wages disappears, because there's fewer and fewer people organized in a way that can put pressure on employers, wages drop. The other part of the picture we need to remember is workers in America are no, and now I sound like either Republican or Democratic or someone else's fucking talking points, you are actually competing with workers in other countries, like China, like India, where there is zero worker protection. Last year, easily over 350,000 people died on the job in China. You don't see it in the news, but every single day, Chinese miners die, period, full stop. Terrible anecdote about China. My same friend who used to build buildings in the Middle East built buildings in China for a while. He had the same problem after the following story. They were designed, and again, this is about like, how do we treat people? How does the law protect them? When you're a 1099er, you don't have a lot of protection because you're not, quote, an employee. You're really floating out there on your own. You often also end up signing contracts which require you not to go through the court system to maybe get the wages you're owed, but through some arbitration system which is actually stacked against you. And anyone who's ever tried to get something from AT&T knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? So the wage situation, as you are attempting to negotiate, what's your relationship to this employer? You may not even know anyone who works at Amazon at all because you are separated by so many layers. That separation also makes it extremely difficult for workers to band together and unionize. At a workplace like Abercrombie & Fitch, which is a retail clothing outlet. Remember, we've got a 70% service economy right now, okay? In order to keep worker flexibility, they have 1,500 workers on call for 300 actual equivalency work jobs. They are hired, or they are told to come in based on how the sales are going on 15-minute blocks. So if on a particular Thursday that it's raining, people aren't coming in, you will get an email or a text 15 minutes before your shift is to start telling you don't bother to come in today. I have a friend who worked for a union and she was a salter. A salter is, don't tell anybody this because it's a big secret. Unions send workers into workplaces as workers, disguised as workers, to see if it's feasible to unionize a workforce. At the end of her 3-month stint at a particular retail store in New York City, the union plant was the senior employee. That's how much turnover there was, okay? So this is why, I mean, the irony there, or the tragedy there, is so intense, it's almost overwhelming. It's Shakespearean in its dimension, right? But Abercrombie & Fitch loves the fact that everybody is on their toes, working and wondering and waiting to see if they're going to actually get called in to have the luxury of working that day. And if you don't get called in, you don't get to work. And if you get another job that doesn't allow you to come in because they only gave you a 15-minute warning, you'll get fired for that too. And so this gig economy that everyone's talking about, that, as President Bush, the second President Bush said, would unleash the entrepreneurial power of every American, is really, in my opinion, a cover story for finding out how to pay people less for the same amount of work. And as this structural nature of the economy changes, and more pressure is put, downward pressure is put on wages, we're going to begin to see the types of social and political crises that we used to imagine only happened in developing countries, where people didn't have enough basic money to survive, where they didn't have the fundamental necessities of life, right? We now in America, the median income of a family of 4 is roughly about $54,000 a year, which is only 100% of poverty wages. Most economists will tell you that the poverty level, which is at about $25,000 for a family of 4, is woefully inadequate. It's like a joke. So that the median of 54 is a much more realistic bare necessity. So what we're really saying is approximately half of the country, from economists' standpoint, is essentially living at subsistence wages. This is going to be exacerbated by the increase in these non-standard, or what is referred to as non-traditional work situations. There seems to be no way to stop this trend unless workers decide to do something about their working conditions. And given that there is a history of organizing against this type of, let's call it, lack of rigor in employment in the 19th century, it might provide some kind of model for early 21st century workers on how to organize themselves. Traditional industrial unions like the UAW, like the communication workers, like SIEU, are now reaching out to service employees. They're reaching out to temporary workers who work like in temp services. They're reaching out to people who are subcontracted, right? Because that's not really temporary work, because you work. Here's the weird part. You work full-time for the subcontractor, but you may be sent to different places each time. So the question, again, is how do you organize someone who's being pushed around from different workplace to different workplace? How do you organize someone who the company is not even considering an employee, right? One of the primary factors in becoming unionized is you have to be identified as somebody's employee. If you can't be identified as UPS or FedEx or Amazon's employee, it's virtually impossible to unionize you. And so the structural changes are what we need to think about here. I think there's one more chart I wanted to show. Wait, here, this is a disturbing one, and it's connected very much to this one. As union membership grows and the share of income going to the top percent increases, you then start to get this type of inequality. Because I want you to remember that every time some middle person comes between you and whoever's telling you what to do, you lose some of that money, right? It's like the bag of weed that gets smaller every time it gets resold to somebody, okay? What we're seeing here now is the radical transformation, again, in the latter half of the 20th century, which the middle half was anomalous, where everybody's wages were growing. And in 1956, I believe it was, you had the closest gap between those at the bottom and those at the top. What we start seeing here as we see the flattening of wages for everybody is this is the top 5th percentile. And look at how their wages are growing. They have captured the vast majority of wage and income growth since the 2012 crash. Approximately 95% of it, really. Which means that 5% of all the growth, the recovery, you know, that great stock market increase, the great increase in corporate wealth, is not actually going to the majority of the population as it seemed to here, right? Because as the businesses did better, so did everybody else. Somewhere else in here I may have a thing about CEO pay, but you all know the CEO pay thing. CEO pay up, everybody else down. I think now it's a ratio of 1 to 300, roughly, the wages of the, so your average Joe Schmo at, I don't know, the Knickerbocker Manufacturing Company, since we're in New York, is making, the guy who's the CEO is making 300 times more than his average worker. 40 years ago, it was about 14 times. And so again, what we're seeing as this new economy emerges, with fewer and fewer people being, quote, steadily employed, is a continuing increase in income inequality. I have no problem asserting that this continued or growing income inequality is absolutely tied to the fundamental dismantling of what had been considered the American corporate welfare deal, which was, we'll accept capitalism, but there's got to be a little bit of payback in terms of things like unemployment, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. That's what was called the capitalist welfare state, you know, sort of invented by the Germans and sort of invented by FDR and the other Keynesians, right? That deal arguably has been broken. Because if you have been watching the news, if you can stand to watch the news anymore, that security net is being eroded at every turn. And so even the fundamental relationship between the government, its management of corporations, and how those corporations then treat its employees is being fundamentally altered. We're coming up on, what, 75 years, give or take, since the Great Depression and the legalization of unions in 1935 by the Wagner Act, the creation of Social Security, the creation of unemployment. And one of the weird things is that those programs have been so successful, like unions in mid-20th century, that essentially people have forgotten how necessary they may be. I think it's best typified, and this seems like it's off course, but it's actually not. I think it's best typified by the people who during the campaign or just before the presidential campaign were saying, keep your government hands off my Social Security. We have forgotten, I would argue in many ways, how the American economy actually became a dominant economy in the world, in which workers shared to a certain degree in the benefits that went with an increasing income for the people they worked for. So our new gig economy is one that at every turn is essentially picking the worker's pocket in one way or another. Because you are now responsible for all of your own overhead, your office, your own health insurance. I mean, you know, really every part of what was considered a job 20, 30 years ago is now being laid at the doorstep of the worker individually. I gave this talk at a place in Brooklyn that was called a cooperative. A collective, pardon me. And I hope nobody's here from there. I did the stupid thing of asking, oh, it's a collective, so like what's the management structure and how does the board get together to decide about how you do things? And I was told, well, it's not really a collective, it's owned by this guy and he rents space out to us and we called it a collective because it sounded kind of cool and edgy. So it's not a collective, it was office space you rent to people who don't have jobs to go to because they work for themselves. And it was funny, tragic, sad to me to see this word collective being inserted in this completely capitalist, and I don't mean that in any way other than pejoratively, capitalist working environment, right? And so, here's what we got to think about. How can American workers of whatever stripe you're talking about, whether it be someone who is as low paid and as low skilled as a health home aide, or as high paid and high skilled as a computer programmer, gonna do as this structural change to the economy continues? Because all indicators are that the relationship between worker and employer is gonna continue to deteriorate, and we're gonna have more and more downward pressure on wages, more and more loss of benefits. So when we have an increased loss of benefits, things like having the Obamacare, as it is sometimes pejoratively referred to as, actually becomes a really big deal. And anybody out there who was trying to buy health insurance before that knew how insanely expensive it could be. And again, one of the things we've got to think about here, from my perspective as a historian, is how there has been a successful cultural, what do I want to call it here? Brainwashing? That sounds a little harsh. There has been a successful acculturation to actually think of yourself as a little economic island, not tied to anyone or anybody else. And if what I don't get, I've got to get from somewhere else, as if it's a zero-sum game. Right? Which in fact, please remember, in the history of organizing, in the history of increasing wages in the industrial economy from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century was in a very different environment, where workers in fact saw themselves as in the same plight, even if you weren't in the same business. The largest, most successful unions in the history of the United States are the AFL and the CIO. They're not trade unions in the sense that, oh, I'm all auto workers, but I'm all workers, we're all workers. As that group of workers becomes more and more atomized, what is going to be the political and socioeconomic fallout is the next question we may have to deal with. Because it's really easy for people to point to government programs like unemployment and Social Security because they deal with traditional workers who've been paying into unemployment through their job and been paying into Social Security through their job. But if they've not been in what you and I think of as a traditional job and have not been paying into those pools of government money that is then held and doled out later, two questions. What does that mean for that worker in terms of his or her retirement? And let me just tell you, 401ks are a fucking scam. 401k puts the onus for your retirement on you. As if you can outtrade Goldman Sachs computers that are working in, and if you haven't read about this, go look it up and be scared. Goldman Sachs essentially now makes money in microseconds on trades because they get fed not the shit that you see in NBC and NBC, which is 15 minutes behind the actual trading time, right? They have real life trading information, which essentially allows them to predict what the people are going to do 15 minutes later and can buy and sell things literally in microseconds, nanoseconds, and make zillions of dollars on a fraction of a penny difference. How in the world are you and I slaving away in whatever cubicle we're slaving away in, either at home or at office, going to be able to compete with that? The traditional pension that arose out of the 19th century capitalist work structure was the corporation was responsible for providing you with your retirement. It's called the defined benefits plan. Right now, Republicans and some Democrats have decided that all of the public workers who sign contracts for less money and retirement benefits are bad people who are making our country poor, and we need to take their pensions away now. If you haven't read about it, go ahead and read about what's happening in Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. I mean, it is like grossly immoral. But let's get back just one more second to the 401k. Because it also ties us into the very this is like the worst scenario possible. We become accomplices in our own victimization. Because as we are fighting against this type of division of wealth and changing economic structure, you fucking hope that when you come to retirement, the market is high, because then you'll have a nice portfolio. If you happen to be some schmuck who retired in 2008, you're fucked. The market lost half of it. Well, it lost half of its value, which means all the money you've been putting away, which again, now you're responsible for it, as opposed to the state if you're a state worker, or opposed to, like, say, Chrysler if you used to work for Chrysler. You are now responsible for it. And so the corporation can literally wash its hands of its responsibility to you even after a lifetime's full of work. So when we're reading these articles about the gig economy, let's not get like sucked into the Fiverr, like, you know, acculturation, like sexy freelance, like I get to stay at home and sleep at night and work in the day and party in between. And like, I mean, it's really sold as some bizarre, sexy new work arrangement that's going to allow you to just break free and be your own fresh butterfly and get rid of that old musty chrysalis of, like, you know, stodgy 20th century capitalism where you had a job with benefits and retirement and an office and sick days and a vacation. I mean, who wants sick days and a vacation? Only sick people and tired people. And if you're sick and tired, then you have a moral failing, because you shouldn't be sick and tired. You should be in there working, goddammit, because that's what God, Jesus, and your boss wants. So here we have the confluence of both economic trends, i.e. corporations wanting to not pay you a lot for shit, and some kind of cultural programming to allow you to think this is just fine, to adjust our psyche to a, let's call it, deteriorating economic condition, but find a way to say, no, it's okay, I just got to get a positive attitude and get my LinkedIn site working really well and get, I mean, right? LinkedIn, Facebook, are you fucking with me? Like, this is what your economic future is like. Yeah, I have 500 friends who have 500 friends who have 500 friends, and I'll make $1 million. The only worst thing to that is the acculturation, again, the personal bit, where you see articles like how to think like a rich person, how to make decisions like a billionaire. But what decision does a billionaire make? I mean, first off, remember, in this country, statistically speaking, the majority of large-scale wealth is inherited. It is not earned. Are there exceptions? Of course there are. There are exceptions to every rule. Hey, there were slaves who were freed. Does that make slavery good? I mean, Arthur Schindler in Schindler's List, remember how nice he was to all the Jew slaves he didn't kill? Does that mean the whole thing was fine? Not really, no, right? So exceptions don't prove the rule in this case. So again, we're seeing how you have a confluence of hard data. I mean, look, There's data, it's charts, there's numbers, it's different colors. They go up and down, there's dates on them. It's like real stuff. But in an effort to process this, what was the really, oops, oh, that's the worst one. In an effort to process this real stuff, we make up a story that unions make people lazy, that unions protect bad workers, that unions are corrupt. Sure, as corrupt as the society in which they exist. I mean, you pick an institution and we'll find where it has problems. It could be the church, it could be the school system, it could be the transit system, it could be private corporations. But I have a hard time buying that a union or a church or a school is any more corrupt than the rest of the society in which it floats. But every single one of us in this room has been fed the line that unions are bad because they protect lazy workers. And one of the things we need to see then is, in addition to the numbers and charts and stuff, there's actually a lot of thought control going on. So how do we then think of ourselves as workers, as employees, as skilled or non-skilled? What is our due in this case? Are we, I mean, what are we due? Is healthcare a human right? Is education a human right? Is drinking water and edible food a human right? And I know all of a sudden I'm getting NGO over here, but they're actually all tied together again still, because it's about how society decides to regulate itself. And that's actually you and me as both workers and members of a society. How are we going to decide to regulate ourselves? I've recently come back from Spain, and I had an interesting conversation with a guy there whose family is, apparently this is, you know, during the Franco regime, there were a lot of what were called silent socialists. You really couldn't speak up. And so we got this family where one grandfather was a silent socialist and the other one was a big Franco supporter. And what my friend was, we were talking about healthcare. And what my friend was explaining to me was that both of his grandfathers, on completely opposite ends of the spectrum, would have never in a million years proposed taking away nationalized health insurance. Because as far as they were concerned, it was a point of pride that Spain took care of its people. This is a totally different cultural attitude that is currently being fronted by both American citizens and American politicians. Somehow, your pre-existing condition is your fault. And so it's okay if your genetically programmed diabetes is going to cost you more when you get health insurance. And so when we're thinking about economics, we've also got to think about the cultural and intellectual and the philosophical components that go into making up an economic picture that allows for greater and greater wage inequality, greater and greater benefit inequality, and frankly, if we go back to that, that one, dramatically declining life conditions for Americans for the past 40 years. And it's not a surprise that since the Reagan campaign, politicians have been promising you, and Jesus Christ, the last one did exactly the same thing, to get back to the good old days. Make America great again. The problem is none of those guys have any interest in actually returning to an economy where businesses have some responsibility to their employers. And that may be the biggest structural change that we're dealing with here. What is the responsibility of an employer to his or her employee? I'll leave it on that, and then we can take whatever questions you've managed to glean from this mishmash of a talk of mine. Thank you very much.
Union membership slide, on the union membership slide, one of the things that kind of jumps out at me as a maybe a additional explainer of the distribution of wealth to the top 10% is the top marginal tax rate during that time. It actually is a similar inversion of that, and I think that is an interesting way of thinking about what are the ways we fund the changing contract. It's like, okay, well, if nationalized healthcare, if retirement benefits are things we want to fund, then going back to a time where we had a 90% top marginal tax rate, when we have so much wealth being concentrated at the top, is being a potential additional answer to kind of how we change the contract, not just at the corporate level, but at the government level as well.
Just let me, anecdotally speaking, at a time when union membership was really high in the 50s and the president wanted to have like an economic summit, not only would he call like CEOs from different companies, he'd call the head of the of the AFL-CIO, or he'd call the president of the UAW to come together so that labor and management were both being consulted, right, in what are the future plans. Now, I'm romanticizing a little bit, but I'm allowed to do that because it sucks really bad now, so past must have been much better. Look at Trump's cabinet. They're a bunch of kleptocrats, and I mean that in the most positive way possible. So the fact that Trump wants to propose a top tax rate, and if you haven't heard this, hold on to your seats, of 25%, goes very much to the book Capital in the 21st Century, where he talks about that economics is not a thing that happens in some vacuum. Economics is actually a lot to do with politics. And if millions and 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 millions of Americans got on the street and actually started complaining about the top marginal tax rate, who knows what the difference might be? But that is a huge component of this graph. That one of the reasons the wealthy have been accruing so much more wealth is because the taxation on how they earn their wealth, their income tax has become very low, and the capital gains tax has become very low. Really, really, really rich people don't work. They just live off other people working, you know, like the mean travelers in England who are living luxurious lifestyles in their two-bedroom suburban home. So politics is a result, arguably, of social pressure, which is arguably a result of either discontent or affirmation for the situation. If Americans weren't, and this is again, here we're going to the cultural soft side of this. It's not an uncommon description, and it's a pejorative one, that Americans all think of themselves as pre-rich. Right? I think it's attributed to F. Scott Fitzgerald, the one that he says Americans think of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Right? I would say now Americans think of themselves as yet to be discovered American Idol stars. And part of that mentality is, well, when I become rich, I don't want to pay all those taxes so all those fucking lazy people can sit around and not work. And in fact, deliberately not go to work so they can collect their $90 worth of food stamps. How dare they live so well on my tax money? Which, remember, part of the Obamacare repeal is actually an economic thing, not just a tax, not just a healthcare thing. Because part of the way Obamacare is paid for was by a very specific tax on the wealthy. So you could kill the healthcare thing by actually changing the tax structure, but you're not changing the tax structure, you're actually changing the health bill structure. So that is a very important part of this conversation. And here's where I'll just add one more thing, and then you can go and get more depressed. If you think there are problems with the federal tax structure, go ahead and take a look at state taxes. State taxes are as regressive, it's like the Middle Ages. In some states, the top tax bracket is 15%. And as the federal government, right, withdraws its support for all sorts of programs and puts the onus back on the state to pay for them, where there is a highly regressive tax structure, you get the poor paying, again, a much higher percentage. And this has been a subject of conversation in America for a very long time. Why do the poor think so stupidly, right? This is like they don't know how to think. What? Don't the poor know that the chances of winning the lotto are really small? Yes, they do. But so is the likelihood of your job at Target making you a millionaire. And so from some actually bizarre standpoint, it's reasonable for people of lower economic demographics to be spending their money on lotto tickets. Because again, the tax structure, which is a political social event, is a huge contributor to the larger economic picture. But the only thing we hear, I would argue, about taxes from our politicians is how to cut them, not what they go for. I think it's Oliver Wendell Holmes who had the great quote, "Taxes are the price you pay for civilization." I like that. I think that's, We right now in this country, we've got a serious infrastructure problem. Donald Trump has promised a big bill to, yeah, right. It's a bunch of fucking privatization bullshit, okay? He's gonna sell all the highways off to, you know, like Halliburton or something, okay? But you know, like, subway trains don't repair themselves. It's not a tree, right? But again, I think we forget, we become accustomed to a thing being there and forget it needs maintenance, right? And so I give you the easy example. 80% of the cost of any building is its maintenance over its lifetime, not its construction. Everyone's like, oh my God, they spent $20 million to build a building. Yeah, well, they're gonna spend another $80 million over its lifetime to keep it up. So right now, I think it's the American Association of Mechanical Engineers gives the American infrastructure like a C- and says it is a minimum $3 trillion, that's a T, trillion dollar investment to get it up to like not falling apart. And again, it's a tax issue, it's a social issue, it's a who's responsible for it issue. And as we speak, governors are closing their yearly budget gaps by attempting to sell off public works. Cuomo wanted to sell off the Tappan Zee Bridge. And it looks great the first year you collect $1 billion for it, but then every year after that you have no idea what's gonna happen. In Pennsylvania, where they sold off some highways, in addition to selling the highway to a private contractor, part of the contract was that the state couldn't work on the public roads because that would give competition to the private company that just bought the highway. Yeah, it is. Should we go down the list of other stupid things? But again, like, I would argue that we see these things as very atomized instead of being part of the bigger picture. How does the tax structure pay into not having money for shit? This gentleman had his hand up too, I think. Last question. Yeah.
Hello. So I've worked with tech companies, and I've noticed the increase in responsibility, you know, but not a correlation in the increase in compensation and
Right.
in salary and benefits.
Right.
So, you know, with this talk, I mean, I guess I don't want to like be so tech and like suggest action steps, but are you advocating for either an alternative system to what we have, or just for people to honor the system that we have had for the past few decades?
Well,
in terms of pensions and
yeah,
Roth
I would
IRAs
say
and-
that my practical side is a New Deal Keynesian Democrat. It'd be really nice if we collected more taxes from the rich and paid for public schools. I could be happy for that. Idealistically, I'm an anarcho-syndicalist where I think we should all learn how to get together and we don't really need government in the way to oppress us and keep us down or whatever. But practically speaking, yeah, I would say we need an action plan to sort of understand that the economy, if we can use that gross term, is meant to serve everybody, not just the top 5%. So it would be an action plan to retake, in some way, control of elements of the economy that have created the type of inequality, that we see in this type of graph. And there are more ways than you and I can count that people can take action. And no workplace is the same. You can't have a cookie cutter approach to everything. So I think that every workplace and every employee and every field or every skill set is going to have to think about how do we fix the problems in our industry. Perhaps the first step in any of this is the Marxist one, which is class consciousness. Realizing that the structural nature of your economy is not weighted in your favor, and so that your positive attitude is not necessarily what's going to be the game changer. It's how do you come together with your fellow workers to deal with the macro crisis of flatlining wages, declining government support, and a really, really vicious oligarchy that wants to keep all its money for itself.
So, I mean, I noticed that the tension between like what we want the world to be and what we want the economy to be and what it actually is. And so in terms of next steps, are there any examples you can offer in terms of countries or regions that are trying to maintain
Well,
that kind
like
of
I
balance?
said at the beginning, you know, America as an industrialized country, you and I have the greatest overhead of citizens in any industrialized country. So I would say there are examples of things like socialized medicine, free college. I mean, all of those things already exist and they work in the world. They wouldn't be terrible things for us to consider doing. I am not by any means at this moment suggesting, you know, like we can step into some kind of socialist utopia in a day or a week or a month or a lifetime. I am saying, rather, that there are many other advanced economies that have been able to survive and pay health insurance for their citizens. So that simply because America has this idea that we're the best is really probably not true. And so there are many aspects of the larger political and economic picture that we can pick and choose as examples for us to maybe imitate.
So, I mean, there are people not necessarily in this room who would hear socialized medicine and the economy and think that they're mutually exclusive in terms of economic growth.
Yeah.
But
I would argue they're not.
I don't know necessarily who will listen to this, like beyond the people in this room, but what are there any historical or contemporary examples that you found in your work of people who have like of countries or regions or even like municipalities or districts that have achieved economic growth while still not just talking about issues like healthcare and education, but who have actually like invested in that over a long period of time?
Again, I would point to the industrialized economies in Europe, which now we've got some problems with austerity now, so it's a little more variegated. But again, the industrialized economies in Europe have managed to survive. The Germans, for example, the French to a certain degree, while still providing far more services to their citizens than we imagine possible. If you're asking me for like some, like, you know, like this particular point in time, I would probably point back to like America during the Depression or Johnson administration with the Great Society program or Medicaid, where with one act of legislation, all of a sudden a whole group of people got protection they didn't have before. It was absolutely predicted to fail. Ronald Reagan, our favorite Alzheimer's president, right? Ronald Reagan in 1962 or 63 made records against the introduction of Medicaid that were played in little like John Birch Society meetings all over the country, in which he predicted that if Johnson's Great Society program went forward, America would be a socialist dictatorship within 10 years. I guess what I would point to here is that all of the predictions that have always been made about, oh my God, if we do this thing, Obamacare, if we do this thing, public education, if we do this thing, fire departments, the world is going to come to a screeching halt, have pretty much always been absolutely false. I, at the moment, can't think of a social program, I'm sure if we look we might find one, but I can't think of one that has actually torn down and destroyed civilization as we know it. So that's the best I can do, like off the top of my head. But with a little time and a search engine, I might be able to find you some more specifics. So if you want to get an email address, I'll see what I can do.
Okay, cool.
Okay. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. I know you just finished clapping, but one more round of applause for Jessica and Ward. Perfect. Thank you.